elected.
Damien Green.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady from Central Ayrshire. I think the opposition is quite right to want to debate this issue, and I also think very strongly that the long-term solution to the problem of funding care, particularly care for the frail elderly, is going to be something that requires cross-party agreement. So I would hope this debate can take place in a relatively non-partisan way. I agree, therefore, with the Honourable Lady who opened the debate for the Labour Party that there does need to be radical change. But I would gently put to her and her colleagues that in this area, which is long-term, complex, that indignation is not enough. That actually simply saying we must spend more money at the same time as saying but we must restrict the amount of money we take from other people, which I understood to be the important part of her speech, doesn't cut it. Can I give way? I'll certainly give way to the Honourable Gentleman because I'm about to mention him in a second. So if he'd like to wait for that to intervene, I'm also conscious of time. So there does need to be radical change. The Green Paper needs to be radical and brave. And that's because although in this debate, as in the wider debate on this issue, a lot of people talk about how we're living in an ageing society, as a society we haven't remotely adjusted to what that means yet. Our population is projected to grow by around 10 million over the next 40 years, and almost all that growth comes from older people. And within that, it particularly comes from those in the oldest age group. There are 5.3 million people over 75 in Britain today. That number will double to more than 10 million in 40 years' time. So this is why this is not just a looming problem, it's an actual problem today. Because there is both a short and long-term problem to solve. And frankly, in the spirit of non-partisanship, no party in this House has an unblemished record in using social care as a political football. Phrases like death taxes and dementia taxes make good copy, they can affect the outcome of elections, but they don't help rational debate, and more importantly, they don't help us improve the lot of these increasing millions of older people. So
I wonder if by saying that, I thank the member for giving way, right honourable member for giving way. I wonder if he's admonishing his own Chancellor, who used that expression "death tax" in his last budget debate. Yeah.
The phrase "death tax" I think dates back to the previous Labour government's attempt to solve the problem in 2008, and I'm sure the phrase "dementia tax" was used by the Honourable Lady during the last election campaign. So I hope she would reciprocate to my attempt to be non-partisan here. So far, it doesn't feel like it. But in the short term, the challenge for the government is one both of capacity and quality of care. But both of those problems are going to become more difficult in the long term. There's a range of things that, again, as a society, we need to do. Before people need social care, we need to keep people active longer. We need to keep them in the workforce longer because that's good for their health. We need to have changes to the planning system so that we can keep people in appropriate housing of their own for longer. But in the end, the nub of this issue will come down to funding. And I want directly to address one of the points made by the Honourable Lady for the SNP about joining the whole thing up with health funding. I think there is, although I agree with the broad thrust of the ideas, the 10 principles put out by the Honourable Gentleman from North Norfolk and the Honourable Lady from Leicester West, as well as my own Honourable friend from Grantham yesterday. And in particular, I think the idea of hypothecation is an idea whose time is coming. But I do think there's the problem with the model of simply saying that we should integrate the whole of health funding and social care funding. It's a no-brainer that organisationally social care and health care need to be much better integrated. So for the individual, they're not trying to negotiate a very complex system, as the Honourable Lady has just said. But if we simply roll the whole funding together into one pot, a sort of national health and social care fund, I think there are two serious dangers. The first is that social care will take over for mental health as the Cinderella of the health system, never quite at the top of the priority list when money comes to be allocated. And the second is that no one feels that their contribution is related to their personal needs. And the effect of that is that some of the sources of funding that could be available, and I agree with all those who said we need more funding, such as, for example, the £1.7 trillion of equity that we have in residential property, of which more than 2/3 is possessed by the over 65s, are in danger of being permanently excluded. And that, I think, would be a great mistake. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's making a very thoughtful and reasonable contribution. He puts the suggestion forward that if there was a completely combined, united funding stream for health and social care would be relegated, would be disadvantaged. But of course, under both Labour governments and the Coalition and the Conservatives, social care does lose out here and now compared to NHS funding. And does he also... He complained about people who just use indignation, and he made the case for cross-party working. But does he share my frustration that those of us who've tried to make the case for working together just get constantly rebuffed from the government? And will he join us in pressing the Prime Minister to actually engage in this so that we can make it a reality?
I agree with him that cross-party working is necessary, and I would gently point out that when I was a member of the government, I actually met him and the Honourable Lady and a cross-party group precisely to discuss this, because I had responsibility for this policy area because I wanted to work with them. I thought in government it was the only way to go forward, and I still do. There's obviously not time today to go into detailed funding proposals, but I think we have to accept that in the long term, the funding of social care will not only need to be more generous than it has been in recent years, but it will have to be fair and seen to be fair to every generation. And I would make the point, which is not often made in this context, that intergenerational fairness means being fair to older people as well as younger people. The view has taken hold in some circles that being over 60 means being overprivileged, and I would strongly challenge that view. The current generation of 50 and 60-somethings are the first who are often simultaneously trying to help their children with housing and their parents with care needs at the same time. But this isn't special pleading for one particular cohort. It's important to remember the very obvious but very salient point that young people themselves will grow old, and setting one generation against another is not only a bad basis for policy making, it's very short-sighted for the individuals most affected. So instead, we need to find a solution that will provide stability for decades to come. And I suspect that one of the propositions that will unite us on all sides is that however much better we get at using technology and housing design to keep people in their own homes for longer, the sheer growth of numbers needing some kind of care will mean that we will need to find more money. And precisely because this is a problem for decades ahead, not just the rest of this Parliament, it is vital that the solution has cross-party support. And this is a challenge for all parties in this House. And one other issue, I think, that is often ignored but is fundamental. Should this be a national or a local service? I'm struck that in my own area, 44% of Kent County Council's budget now goes on adult social care, and this number will only rise. And I'm also struck that in contrast to almost every other area of policy that involves local government, in this instance, I talked to local councillors about this, and they say maybe this should be dealt with at a national rather than a local level. They almost don't want it to be their responsibility anymore, and that is practically unique. So I hope ministers will address that. And one other area I would urge ministers to include in the Green Paper is that of staffing needs. It's been mentioned on all sides, the importance of this. And I think that given the wider situation post-Brexit, I think we need to find ways both of using technology but also being much better training care workers from the British population and indeed raising the status of care work, as has been mentioned, I think, in interventions from the Labour benches, and I agree with that. Because looking at care work purely as a business sector, it seems to me a classic case where a combination of technology and the human touch are both vital in providing high-quality care. Putting it starkly, a robot may be able to do the lifting part of the work, but can't provide the words of encouragement and comfort that are equally necessary. So I think this will be an employment growth sector in the decades ahead. Getting social care right is clearly one of the biggest challenges facing this government, as it would be for any government for many decades to come. What we have over the next couple of years is the chance to reset the debate so that it becomes calmer and more realistic. And I know that my right honourable friends, the Secretary of State and the Care Minister, will want to provide that care and realism. And I hope that those of us contributing to this debate from the outside will also live up to that. And I very much look forward to the publication of the Green Paper in the coming months. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.